Thank you for having me. My dear bar Helen couldn't be with us today. She's got other stuff on. So I'm Kylie, and yeah, I'm here to speak with you about Gunja, or Amarda as it's called in Helen's language. So how many people use Amarda, what it looks like when people are dependent or hooked, and some tips for helping whole communities. In our story, I'm going to show lots of pictures, but it does include some photos of people who have passed away. So I just want to let you know that those are coming, and we show the photos with permission from the families. I want to start by acknowledging that we're all meeting here today on Garramilla, Darwin on Larrakia land, and paying my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I also want to thank the Andalagwa people and the Land Council, the Good Island and Bickerton Island health clinics. I was reflecting with Helen as well as with Peter last night about some of the story I'm going to tell you. I keep saying we because I expect Helen to be here. Some of the story I'm going to tell you today goes back almost 20 years. So I did say to Peter, I'm sort of starting to feel slightly older now. When I first met Helen in her hometown of Anurugu. And this very much collaborative work was led by Helen's people, a range of services and fellow clinicians, like some of you might know, Jenny Langrell and Gloria O'Hare, with people like me, with researchers. And core to this work was our big sister, who's since passed away. So some of you might know Muriel. Muriel Jaragba was simply an astounding human being and a trailblazing leader and a senior Aboriginal mental health worker, and she was Helen and my big sister, or Diaba in Antilaqua language. You might not know she was also Health Worker of the Year on the national stage in 2011 at the Deadly Awards, and she kind of dressed up and went to the Sydney Opera House for that with Jenny. And she was also admitted into the Honour Roll, so the Hall of Fame at the 2020 National Indigenous Drug and Alcohol Awards. Muriel was famous around Australia, not just in the NT. And today, Helen and I would like to dedicate this talk to her. So Gunja, as you might know, is the most commonly used illicit drug worldwide. Gunja, Yandi, cannabis, Amarda, lots of different names. In 2010, more than 4% of people around the world, so age 15 to 64, so that's around 209 million people, said they use Gunja, and that's in the last 12 months. So we're not looking at ever use. I kind of never look at the ever users because that includes people who are hooked and the people that might have just used once. But that's 4% who are kind of currently using. So this graph shows how many people use Gunja from lots of different Australian data. Okay. So there's the axes. So this first blue line shows current Gunja use across the whole of Australia over time. You can see on the left-hand side from 2001 right through to 2019 with the last National Drug Strategy Household Survey. You can kind of chart it. It's gone a bit above, it's gone a bit down, but it's around 1 in 10 people. And that survey collects data from people 14 and older. This next line is the national data of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it's the orange line, and we can see here that more people are using Gunja, around double. But this data set is 15 years and older because, you know, in Australia we can't quite streamline things. This data we can see from some of the Arnhem Land communities we've done studies in. I'm only showing this particular study, because it actually collected data over time. So there are lots of studies where we call it a cross-sectional, it's like a snapshot or a camera shot of what a community is doing. But this community we actually went in 3 times, and that's why I'm showing it to you here. So you can see that the number of people remained high from 2001 through to 2005 and 6. It slightly dipped, but that was only in women and in older men. And then it went up again to the 6 in 10 or so, and that's people currently using Gunja. If we look at how much people smoke each time, so sometimes in those national reports they call it per session or per occasion use, you can see on the right-hand side an average of just over 7 cones smoked each session, so quite heavy, and that's about double than what we see in the national side on the left-hand side, which is 3.2. And the Arnhem Land data comes from interviews that Muriel and I did together, and the national data comes from self-report data from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. But when we look at how many people use Gunja every day, we can see that nationally, the bottom line, 1 in 7 Australians say that they're using Gunja every day. And it's probably an underestimation as well, because we are asking about an illicit drug. But right at the top, where you can see I did some data collection, you can see most people are smoking every day in some of the studies that we're doing, so it's almost 9 in 10. So if people smoke Yandi or Gunja every day, and they're smoking many cones each time, it then does raise worries for us in terms of people getting hooked or people getting dependent on cannabis. So the left-hand bar is national data again. They don't collect it in the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. For some reason, they collect it in the Mental Health and Wellbeing Survey. But that's the left-hand side. It's old because they haven't published on it since then, and they haven't made it available. But it shows us around 1 in 5, 20% of people in that national data set were saying that they were reporting symptoms of dependence. The middle bar from Arnhem Land shows that most of the people who were smoking were also experiencing symptoms of dependence, so we're like almost 9 in 10. And when I was kind of thinking about coming up here today, I had another look at the data, and Alan Clough and his team have done another cross-sectional survey in Cape York, which showed it was slightly less than the Arnhem Land stuff, but it's just over 6 in 10 people saying that they had some kind of symptoms of dependence. So far, and they're all the table-y, researchy tables that I'm going to show you. So far we've seen that we're seeing regular use, heavy cannabis use can be common in some of the studies, or the available studies on Gunja use in some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And people consuming when they are smoking double that of the national average. So when we look at studies of non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, because there's way more of them than studies of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, they tell us that if people do smoke often and they do smoke a lot, then you're kind of more likely to expect mental health issues compared with people who say use on a Friday night or just recreationally. So Muriel told me that she was seeing what she thought was more cases of depression in her communities, and so we asked about it. So in her community, Angbuliwa Amaralanga is sickness from cannabis use, and Awarik Parawanga is a word that took 2 months for her and the elders to find. But Werik means chest, and the Parawaranga is it's like an elephant's sitting on my chest, and I can't get up. I can't get up to go to the toilet or do my regular day. It's just really, really tricky. So when we had a look, and this is not data that's able to say anything causes anything here, because it was just that snapshot, cross-sectional data. We found that people who were smoking 6 or more cones each time were actually 4 times more likely to then say that they had these symptoms of depression as well. And I guess that's information that Muriel really wanted to use in terms of then going to Jenny, her health centre manager, and talking to the psychiatrist and trying to work out, this is the need that I'm seeing, how can we address it? And of course, in studies of non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, if people are using more and they are getting mental health concerns, then it has been shown predispositions to schizophrenia and psychosis as well. So I've kind of showed you some of the figures, like the prevalence figures, but I also think it's really important when you're looking at how to address Gunja, it's also important to consider those broader community attitudes as well. So I guess as I'm reading some of these quotes, just reflect in the clients that you see in terms of if this is similar, different, or whatever. So there was a flip side in terms of when I talked to people about Gunja. So some communities said that Gunja can calm people down. So one grandmother said to me, well, I'd rather actually my grandkids smoke Gunja than use petrol or drink alcohol. Other people said that Gunja prevented them from getting into trouble with the police, and these are individuals talking about themselves. So there's that kind of, there's the quote, there's that sort of flip side. But then on the other hand, I had a community leader tell me that if there's a bowl of amara on the table, then we're just going to smoke it till morning, till night. Other people talked about violence that might happen when there's not much Gunja around. Maybe someone's going through cannabis withdrawal. And other people talked about just really significant, big social and mental health impacts from ganja. So people get chained, that's chained to ganja. They don't go hunting, lots of fights, and Amrita becomes the boss. So this is where Muriel really came up with the idea of the fish hook. I was talking with Cass Wright's team on Monday about how how we all use different analogies to get people to understand the clinical stuff that's happening. We were talking about that in the concept of tobacco control and trying to explain concepts of what happens when you have a stroke, for instance, what happens in your brain and that kind of thing. So Muriel came up with this concept of a fish hook to talk about the idea of dependence, that it's literally you're hooked and you can't get away. It's and for her it applies to alcohol dependence, also it applies to cannabis dependence. And I think it's really important to think about ways to get people thinking about these really complex clinical concepts so everyone can understand what we're talking about here. But when people are hooked, often when supply is limited, what we find, and these pictures all come from the new app that we're building on with the drug app, but we find that people can be stressed or tired, they can feel nauseous, they can get headaches, and their mood can really fluctuate. So their mood's going to go up and down. They can also have changing appetite or just not feel like eating. They can get cranky, get into fights and awinyamba and lots of arguments as well. Or they can't sleep, and this is often worst in the first week after having no ganja. And I guess a lot of the things I'm talking about here is kind of trying to assess that risk of withdrawal. And if you haven't seen it, our team did pull together an alcohol and other drug work handbook which was like a reference guide. Leon was a part of that work as well. And so we kind of go through, there's a big cannabis section, so hit me up later and I can kind of give you the link. It's a free book to download. But there are also other impacts from ganja as well. So in this community, there was simply so much money being spent on ganja. So you can see there, up to 2/3 of users' weekly income being spent out on ganja, or 10% of community's income. And that was really useful to feed back that data in terms of getting people to reflect on what else that money could be spent on. And in the clinics, we actually did a separate study where we counted the number of clinic presentations of people who smoke ganja, and we also then did an audit of who's coming to the clinic in terms of presentations for trauma or violence or injury, and there was certainly much more among the people who said that they were currently using cannabis. So far I've kind of shown you those boring prevalence graphs. I've told you a bit about people's opinions in terms of how people are feeling about ganja. We've looked a little bit about what withdrawal looks like, but it's also important to step outside and understand the context of ganja use, looking at all of the other substances that people might be using as well. So multiple drugs, whether that's using multiple drugs at the same time, or people switching, like someone talked about yesterday, when you're switching because there's no supply. So I'm going to show you some of that now. So this picture was commissioned to get people thinking about their tobacco and other substance use actually, but the focus was tobacco, which is why the small writing at the top, the left-hand side says, Enanara Ambuliwa Dambakwalanga, which is like, this is what life would be without tobacco, without dambakwa. And for them, that was like, I'd be strong enough to go fishing the whole day. I'd be strong enough to carry that big diricha, the big digging stick, and dig for yams each day. And that, boy, that's a really hard thing to do. And on the right-hand side, ina angbuliwad nambakwalanga. So this is what happens if you smoke, and what people were typically seeing in this community in terms of the other drugs as well. Because it's really hard to address ganja if you don't look at that whole situation in terms of substance use. So I'm going to kind of firstly look at grog, and this kind of ties in with some of what Peter and Nicole talked about yesterday from the source book as well, actually. And Peter actually was involved in some of this work back in the day in 2006. So in terms of grog, in this community anyway, they've had a permit system since 2005, and that was community driven and requested. Since that permit system, a year later, and this was an evaluation that Kate Conograve and Peter led, they saw reduced DV, emergency call-outs cut by 2/3, but many people drank a lot when they were away, like in Nhulunbuy, in Darwin, in Cairns, and there was a lot of intoxication seen along with harms. So not just in the long grass out of the community, but also people coming back drunk as well. The community also has a history of amalera or petrol sniffing, not so much now at all, like barely anything, the health workers tell me. And in one community, they also drink kava. So in terms of tambaqua, so tobacco, in 2007-8, the communities had a big tobacco control project that I was lucky to be a part of, and it really was born out of the amrita, the cannabis information that we were collecting. And what we found is that, as you can imagine, nearly everyone smoked. There was so much sickness and death from smoking. But in terms of what we could do, it was a real eye-opener for the local health clinics, because simply those, as you can imagine, why would they? But the mass messages just didn't get through. What you're going to produce in Canberra is certainly not going to work in Darwin, let alone in a remote spot. But what I found particularly interesting, because of the healing properties of smoking as well, we did have some amazing community leaders say, well, I smoke in good heart, so I'm not going to get sick from it, because they associate smoking with smoking ceremonies, for instance, as one example. So we've showed you the pretty graphs, I've told you about the opinions, we've looked at withdrawal risks, we've looked at the multiple substance use in which people use ganja. So I guess I wanted to put it together now, all together, because it's also important to consider all of the G's when we address ganja, so ganja and other substance use. So we're talking ganja, we're talking grog, we're talking gambling and card playing, gaming, and of course, overarching to that is grief experienced by communities. And Nick spoke beautifully yesterday for having that truth telling and being really real about why that grief's there and how can we meet each other and move forward as well, help people move forward and go through that healing. So where do we start in terms of when there is so much ganja use? When there is so much use in a community, you might have a really good picture of one house or maybe the house next door, but in my experience, it's just really hard to step back and step outside to see the whole community. If you can't see the whole community, then it's hard to know where to start to address things, which populations in a community we should start with, or what's actually needed. Is it better to be doing prevention now, or do we need to do early intervention, etc.? So what we did is, and one way to get everyone on the same page, was by conducting some local research. So helping communities step back and seeing what was happening across the whole community in relation to ganja use, and to feed this information back to everyone. And as one example, Muriel and I set up a local research team. So they had mental health workers, but they also had teachers, rangers, grandparents, men and women, 11 local researchers in total. And these guys just wanted to make a difference. When I showed them those pretty graphs that I showed you at the start, and they were like, that's not my data. Why should I believe that data? Like, that comes from Canberra people, or that comes from, even if it was Darwin people, it's still not them. It was almost a sense of not quite believing it as well. So part of the approach was to get everyone on the same page, because I firmly believe that addressing ganja use is not just the job of us, it's not just the job of health services, it's everyone's business. And for it to be everyone's business, it's like you're almost training up the community and doing a brief intervention. Everyone needs to talk the same talk, based on the amazing cultural and clinical community expertise, also based on the expertise from the police in terms of what are the current laws for trafficking and possession. And certainly we drew in all of those players so that you're able to give a message that everyone's comfortable with, but also consistent as well. So one way to do this is to feed back those numbers that I showed you earlier in the graphs. But instead of showing it like how I did with lots of maths and an x-axis and a y-axis, etc., we basically took 2 months to talk with the community, everyone working together to think, how could we represent the people whose data they generously gave us their research stories? How can we actually, how can we tell community who we spoke to and what we found? And obviously researchers call it a sample, but you know, how could we talk about our study participants? So we came up with these guys. It's important for everyone to understand the local data, which is what I was saying earlier in the earlier session. So, you know, for me, it's no point if the people at the land council or the health clinics can understand the data. It's not gonna, you're not gonna get the traction to see behaviour change. You really need that 10-year-old boy or girl or child with their grandparents sitting down on the beach. They need to be able to understand the data as well. So we asked a local artist, this amazing artist called Kirk Watt, and to draw these people for us. But Muriel certainly did all the legwork, the hard yards in terms of working out, okay, Kylie's got this sample, the study participants, how do we break up those 5-year age bands that you saw in those boring graphs at the start and transform that into life stages that, that the local Wamamalia would understand. So this is what we came up with. So this picture represents a man in our graphs, Wangorpa, 20 to 36. Here's the woman in our graphs, Wutaringa, 20 to 36. And these are all, I guess, local symbols that were meaningful for the local community. Here's the teenage boy, the Wurundjangaliya, so 10 to 19 years old. Even though our sample is 13, Muriel really wanted me to write it as 10 because particular kind of initiation rituals happen to transform that boy to a man later in life. And lastly, the teenage girl, so the Wura Didiara. So this is how we worked it out. The lighter shaded people smoked amara. To the local researchers, they seemed weaker. They seemed like they didn't have a really strong spirit. They weren't quite there. And then, of course, some people in the graphs some people didn't smoke anything. And for the local researchers, these guys looked healthy, they looked strong. And here's the graph our way. So presenting info like this, I found, can really help to get conversations going. And at the same time, when we did this work, Muriel told me that she felt like more people were coming to her and there were more conversations with services, including the magistrate, the police, the council leadership, to consider what the community could do around drinking. And I think just to make it, ganja use, and just to make it normalised as well, to talk about something like this, particularly as it's an illicit drug. In fact, after this, the community then came to me and said that they wanted to make a film on ganja trafficking because they were seeing so many issues with people in the community, men or women, that didn't have a history of going into Berrima, of them being sort of peer pressured into bringing ganja into the communities, and that's kind of underway. So I guess we each have moments where we have that light bulb moment, you know, when you kind of just get it. And through this feedback process, what we saw is that many people had that light bulb moment. Muriel calls it wa ninganimba araba aganada. It's like, oh, now I get it. I understand what you mean. And it really seemed to motivate people to try and find ways to help understand a range of issues related to ganja use, because in the DVD and the book that we created about this research story, we were also talking about other substance use, kind of very much talking about it from a much more holistic point of view. And then, of course, what you want to see is people having conversations about it, that they're not afraid to have conversations about it, people coming to the clinic, coming to the school, coming to people that they trust to get help for themselves or to get help for a loved one. And basically it made it okay to start to talk about ganja and to get help. And it's just really amazing when you can see that momentum generated because people are motivated to do it, because it's actually my data. It's my data, I own the story, and therefore people are more motivated to try and work out what can we do about it? So yesterday in the Grog app, we were talking about how, you can collect data and then it gets fed back to you. And clinicians like Dan and other people often call that, a model for brief intervention. And when I was preparing for the talk, I was reflecting on how, I'll show you the model actually. I was reflecting on how the process we took to feed back people's findings was actually really similar to this model of brief intervention, which is so commonly used to help people rethink their drinking, but also rethink their drug use. So feedback, people were given feedback based on what they gave us, their story. We listened to them, and I was actually thinking of Nick, because we really did listen to them, like it was that deep, kind of active, deep listening, because it was so important. These were their stories that they were entrusting to us. And as you can imagine, on some of these research surveys, you do ask about some really sad stuff as well, including suicide, self-harm, etc. And then depending on where the person was at, I'm not a clinician, but Muriel and the other team were. So they could then talk with clinicians to get advice, set goals if they're ready to do that or if they want to do that, and come up with some strategies as well. And obviously, as you guys know, it's a model that, if you're ready for the goals, then you just go to the goals. So it's tailored to that individual at that moment in time. So I thought it was kind of interesting to then go in from there to talk about some tips for goal setting. So if someone is interested in rethinking their cannabis use, and in any community, people are going to be at such different stages of change as well. So some people want to try to cut down. So think about briefing the health staff as well as those other service providers, remember, because we're getting everyone to talk the same talk on practical tips that we can give them. So they could buy less each time, avoid using in the morning, have excuses handy if people want to offer you Gunja, or talk to someone about finding other ways to address some of those other underlying issues why they might be smoking Gunja in the first place, like stress and worry. Other people in their stage of change, they might want to stop. So they've had enough, and they might want support from their families and their loved ones to do that. So these are the tips we can give to them. So, think about trying to get pipes and bongs out of the house, or think about spending your money on other things, getting exercise, and seeing a doctor, particularly if they are feeling sick when they're stopping. So if they are going through withdrawal, that's really, really important. But we talked a lot yesterday, and Cass talked about it in her Baseline in the Grass talk about, the importance as well of reducing harms. So in communities where there is so much dependence, I get it. It's too hard to cut down or stop. But how can we keep those people safe? And we then need tips to reduce their harms in relation to their Gunja use. So think about smoking joints instead of bongs, because you're going to get more smoke's going to go this way as opposed to down into you. Think about not mixing with tobacco, certainly, and not mixing with other drugs. This one's tricky, depending on, who else is in your house, but try to limit how much Gunja's in the house. Obviously, if people are smoking, then asking them not to then drive or go to work and be using forklifts and that kind of stuff. Not smoking near kids, and that was a really big thing in terms of the normalisation of just having bongs and other stuff around the house, as Rocket spoke about yesterday. And also spending time with people who don't use as well. For me, there are those tips that kind of focus more on the individual, like cutting down, stopping and reducing harms, but it's also thinking about ways that we can work with whole communities as well. And I don't know if many of you know Jimmy Perry. He's a wonderful Aboriginal drug and alcohol worker colleague of mine. I know Leon knows him really well. Jimmy wrote a section in that book I mentioned before. I call it the black and yellow book because it's black and yellow. And we edited it, and he wrote the section on how to work with whole communities. So Jimmy's a Ngarrindjeri Aranda man, and he speaks about the importance of just trying to be with communities, deep listening, and working out what's meaningful. So what's meaningful alternatives to their substance use, and obviously that needs to be done with all people in the community. So services as well as community members, little E's right through to the white-haired people. And it of course includes working across the silos, like what Peter and Nick were saying yesterday, taking that multi-prong approach. So you're trying more than one thing. And even, you know, we even got to the nitty-gritty of saying, yeah, people love bringing those footy players in, don't they? But it's just one thing, or they love having that one festival. That's great, it's one thing. But then thinking that you need the regular stuff as well for people to be learning and growing and feeling meaningful, finding something maybe that they want to do at school, training, or as a job later as well. And really, that through that, you're getting a beautiful opportunity to play to the local strengths of what the community's into, knowing that, you know, I had amazing people, before I went into research, I had amazing people running a youth development unit, and they were amazing, like, you know, sporting prowess kind of people, and, you know, I can barely walk. So I would do the art stuff, I'd do the music stuff and the film stuff for the people that were into that as well. And in Muriel's case, people were just learning how to make films when we were feeding back this research story. And when we were trying to work out how are we going to tell this message, this numbers, stats, epidemiological data back to communities. So one approach you can take, and what we took, was to create movies. And of course this is just one example from one community because it played to their strengths. So the approach we took, shot by a professional filmmaker, the original ones were done by me on my old Windows Movie Maker file, pretty crap. Muriel, I don't know if you guys like reading the credits of films, I do, but Muriel was what they call an executive producer. And what that means, I was the producer. What that means is that she could basically stop filming at any time. She could change the story. She could just pull it all at once. And that was really important to have that level of leadership over that sort of project. Many other people have written about this approach. In the literature, they call it edutainment, like education, entertainment, and they look at it using a range of health issues, from diabetes to alcohol to HIV. Not much stuff done in alcohol, though, when I was looking for the literature. Muriel always said to me, you know, we really need to be smart in how we get these messages across to communities, so not just boring instructional videos, and we know the pamphlets aren't going to work. We're storytellers, so, you know, let's tell stories. Let's try and weave in the evidence-based messages from the clinic staff and from Kate Conograve, etc., just so that that's good as well, because it means that we want the care, the Gunja care or the alcohol care, whatever is the issue, to reflect those national guidelines. You know, there's an equity of them getting the care that Australia thinks should be the best in this area, but also we want to weave it in a way that plays to their strengths and also can prioritise their local voice as well. So I wanted to finish up by showing you an example of one of the films that we made. This film won the Best Indigenous Resource at the 2010 Australian Teachers of Media Awards. It's not about Gunja. We have that other film that we're trying to finish on Gunja trafficking for Helen's community. This film is about alcohol. And it's probably maybe kind of topical given the morning sessions that we had. Muriel, as always, was the bossy executive producer. I mean that with love, obviously, but it did mean she had the final say, and unfortunately for me, she wanted to make the film as believable as possible. So she gives me a list. I want a plane. I want you to take the whole film crew and the actors to the long grass in Darwin. They live 600 kilometres away. I want to film in the watch house at the police station. That one was easy. I want you to borrow a police car. That was relatively easy. We did that back in the community. And we want to film in Berrima Prison. I made it all come true for her. What I might do is I'll play the film, Wish Me Luck, everyone, and then I'll wrap up at the end.
Are you there? Can I just grab
just gather myself for a second. There are just so many ways to get people, to get communities to reflect on their substance use and their Gunja and their other substance use, and certainly there are no quick fixes, and limited funding and workforce issues are ongoing issues as well. So one way that I found useful is to take a community development approach to research. So you're taking everyone along for the ride, you're working out together what you want to find and how to feed that back. And then that enables you to come up with local solutions based on what their local data finds or shows. You might have seen or some of you might have seen my talk yesterday. So Scott Wilson and Jimmy Perry and others and I were trying to make it easier for communities to collect their own data and to monitor their substance use over time. And I'm really excited by that because it just fits beautifully with Nick's talk in terms of putting the power back in the hands of communities, enabling them to prioritise their voice, use the data to direct what they want in terms of local prevention and treatment efforts, and knowing that, you know, what you're going to do in one town camp is very different to another town camp, for instance. Anyway, I hope that was useful, and I've left lots of time for questions, but please be kind to me. And thank you for having me.
I'm really interested in what you spoke about withdrawal and the role that it plays, and particularly given when you were in the tables part, like reflecting on the correlation with depression, but also thinking about the supply and also thinking about the amounts that people are using. Like, if supply is not solid, people are going to be in a state of perpetual coming in and out of withdrawal. So do you see further scope to look at or try and unpack that idea of what's withdrawal and what's underlying depression?
Dan, I might call on you for some of this. Very clinical question. It's really tricky. There are like many questions in there at once. I mean, in this community...
Withdrawal versus depression is where I'm kind of going with it, yeah?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, in terms of withdrawal, I guess in some communities you're literally seeing, unlike alcohol, where in some communities it's very tightly restricted, so you're actually seeing lower proportions of dependence, and you're seeing high proportions of people who are getting the harms from drinking episodically. In this case, from some of the data, you're seeing people who are smoking a lot, smoking often, they are hooked. So I think I can't really answer the question in terms of depression, because it's the chicken and the egg in terms of what came first when you're working with people who experience so much hard stuff in their everyday life from many generations ago. I think we definitely need to do more work around that, but it was important for me as a researcher to try and find a little bit out in that story, because it was just something that really struck Muriel in terms of something that she was seeing. Dan, do you have anything to add from a clinical perspective?
It's an excellent question to bring together a lot of things from an excellent presentation. In some ways, I've got a lot of thoughts going through my head at the moment, and I think in some ways cannabis withdrawal is depression. In a lot of experiences that I've worked with patients, and I'm talking about patients, not Indigenous patients or non-Indigenous patients, I'm talking about patients. I think as a health professional outside of the drug and alcohol sector, not a lot of health professionals know what cannabis withdrawal looks like, feels like, and so it's hard to talk with people about it in an informed way.
In fact, it was only in the latest, you know how they have those diagnostic criteria, so there's the American one, the DSM, and there's the ICD one, which is the WHO. It was only the last WHO ICD-11 when cannabis withdrawal was actually in there as well. So I think that's why it's so hard for people to talk. Sorry, Jan.
No. have gone through a state of withdrawal, you can experience it. Things like maybe alcohol, where withdrawal starts quite visibly, it goes through and it finishes quite visibly. It's easier to see people go through withdrawal and recognise it as that's what it is. And I think in communities and families where cannabis is more present and it's more there and it's more regular and those ebbs and flows of use are there, like you said, it's probably harder to see in other people and see in yourself. The way I'm feeling now is because I'm not smoking. The way I'm feeling now is because I am smoking, and the way I'm healing myself is by using, which might be I'm using Gunja and I'm treating low mood or anxiety or stress. It might be I'm using Gunja and I'm turning off withdrawal. It might be I'm using Gunja and I'm adding to distress and anxiety and depression. And that's a big thing to pick apart. It's
totally, that's what I'm getting at, yeah.
And that's, I think these conversations that are happening or could be happening or should be happening or are starting to happen in communities and families and individuals who engage with treatment services around what is your story and what's relevant to you. How were things before Gunja came around? How did things change when Gunja came around? And then sort of taking stock of how things are now. A reflection of, I'll shut up in a minute, but a reflection of kind of COVID times was, in the Northern Territory, borders closed, methamphetamine stopped coming in, and there was this kind of, the sudden stop. And I think cannabis, the story was different because it is a bit more sort of stockpileable and available. And even in that time when Gunja use and access changed, and then perhaps, more people are going to be experiencing withdrawal, I think that the tap got turned up a bit more slowly. And so it just sort of all brings me back to it's tricky to pick apart with people, communities and families, and you have to have these conversations about what does use look like and feel like, what does not using look like and feel like, and then importantly, what does that transition look like and feel like? And then for everyone in the room, that's the key thing of how do you support people through that transition of, however I'm using it positively and negatively, that's going to change, and my experience of life is going to change if I go from changing how I'm using it to something different.
And then broader than that, it's about, because the diagnosis has come in very, very recently, it's also getting all of the other services who aren't health focused, understanding that concept and not seeing it, because often when people are going through withdrawal, they're humbugging people even more and they're banging on gates, or they might do break and enter because they want money or they want supply. So not seeing it as a law and order issue or sort of simply bad behaviour as well, but actually seeing that this is part of their withdrawal. They're hooked, like there's something in your brain that's kind of making you do that. It's not, so just actually seeing it with a more holistic lens, I think, is really important.
And I think from the last thing I'll say is from a clinical point of view, the advice on managing cannabis withdrawal is it's just cannabis withdrawal. You're not going to have a seizure like alcohol withdrawal. You're not going to have severe, nasty, impactful withdrawal.
Or tremors and stuff. Yeah.
It doesn't need to be a hospital. It doesn't need to be managed. You just need to get through it. And I don't really agree with that, because it does have such an impact on not just the individual, but on the people around that individual.
And violence and fights were the most, were the biggest sort of pronounced
Money,
feature.
stress,
Yeah, money.
Stress, yeah.
And which then flows over to everyone being up at night, and kids can't go to school, people can't go to jobs because they're tired, because people have been really stressed overnight. So it just, that's why I wanted to put in the slide from Jimmy Perry about working with whole communities, because I think you've got your individual approaches, but you really need your whole community approach as well. You need them done at the same time, depending on where each community's at.
Yeah. And when you're talking about an experience for an individual in a community where maybe up to 9 out of 10 people are using Gunja, my story as I'm going through cannabis withdrawal is probably happening for a lot of people, overlapping at a lot of different points in time. And so, the impact on the community is
totally
big.
And that's what I was saying in your slides, and it's why there's such a, I guess, just not discrepancy. You can see this in it though, why it was on the one hand calming people and on the other hand causing fights. Like, those things aren't mutually exclusive. But if you've got such a high proportion and using such large amounts, like you said, it's exactly going to be happening all the time, which is why it would be cycling down. And to then have to unpack some of the other stuff that we've talked about in terms of trauma-informed care and the chicken and the egg, and how people felt before they used, how they felt when they used, and then how they felt after they've been using for a while. Like, it's a long and complicated story, and I think you know what you've done here is awesome, but it's almost the tip of the iceberg of multiple stuff that could go further.
No, sorry, no. Someone else?
I was just wondering, how did you get that video out to community?
I thought you were going to say you had to get it to work.
Mel?
To make sure that, you know, people that probably needed to reach would see it. And did Muriel, or do you have any information on whether it did change and prompt reflection in the community?
So the question is, how did we disseminate the video, and did it prompt some kind of behaviour change? We got it out by driving around to everyone's house indiscriminately and giving it to everyone. I think because everyone saw us filming, there were a lot of local actors as well. Everyone wanted a copy of it. So it was kind of highly sought after kind of prize in the days where people still just had DVD players. In terms of behaviour change, we didn't go back and do another kind of researchy study, but certainly Muriel felt like it prompted those discussions. So I remember after we disseminated it, I got word that the Women's Refuge Centre had contacted the magistrate, and they thought it was a really great idea to talk about trafficking. And they showed her the film, they talked about trafficking, and there was just like, 150 people there wanting to talk about Gunja. And we weren't talking, in a closed office, in a private space. We were talking out underneath a house where everyone could see, because, hey, it was okay to talk about this stuff because it's everyone's issue. And it was done in a way that it's not a blame game. It's not pointing the finger at anyone. There were several occasions where Muriel and I had to just be careful in terms of keeping everyone's interests, because obviously there are people dealing in communities as well. But it was also just I had conversations with those families as well. That's their story, and their story is part of this story as well. So just being really open and inclusive. And I felt like that was, but as always, Nick, it's so hard to maintain that, and with funding cycles and with workforce issues, particularly around the AOD workforce issues. And she was a mental health worker, but she was straddling the both. She very much saw that she wanted to use research to inform her practice, but she was not the sort of worker who was, I'm not going to do you because AOD is your primary thing. She was very much wanting to do it all. Hello.
So I guess reflecting on that, how would you be able to estimate like baseline depression in a community that's using so much? Like, because maybe a certain level of depression is a natural response to the circumstances people find themselves in. So how is there some way of measuring baseline depression to sort of judge the depression that comes from giving up marijuana against? See what we're getting at?
There would be, but the scale that you would use would be many more items, and I didn't want to inflict that on people, as well as I'm not a medical doctor or a psychiatrist, for instance, or addiction medicine specialist like Dan. So the studies of non-Indigenous peoples would typically, the more gold star studies anyway, would typically have a doctor there as well with an Aboriginal health practitioner to do that, and you'd probably be going in multiple times and you'd be asking them the scale, but then you'd be doing a detailed clinical interview. So there's ways to do it, but very, very onerous as well. Like, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, but I think it's hard to do research well. So if communities wanted to do it, then, and if there was that buy-in to do it, then I think you could do it. But there were just many, many different bits of the research that you'd need to do it well to get that prevalence figure. Because even when we were asking more simple things like consumption of Yandi or Gunja, let alone asking about suicide or dependence, it took ages just for us I was asking it in a mixture of language and their local language as well. So, it takes a while to kind of get those clinical concepts, and we did that entirely with the PHQ-9, so one of the depression scales as well. When we talked to Ernest Hunter's an amazing psychiatrist who's worked in Cape York and over to the top of WA, but the top of Queensland as well. And he sort of was advising us using the PHQ-9, which is why we did. But it was really tricky you almost kind of need to do a study just to check that scale is going to work. I had a Gamilaroi PhD student who's now got her PhD, and she used GrogApp data to look at dependence. And one of the things that she's saying is that you've got the scale. Obviously, we operationalised it with amazingly talented drug and alcohol workers like Jimmy Perry to make sure that he felt like we were asking what the scale wanted us to ask, because you're asking about things like, is alcohol or grog the boss of you, and does it take priority over other things that you want to do? But one of Tegan Weatherall, her PhD thesis talks about the need to be really careful when you're translating any scale, because if you're not getting it right, then you'll be putting all of this effort, but you're not actually getting the data that you want, because maybe that question, how you're asking it, sort of totally means something different to the people who you're asking to, who you want the information from. And I guess that's why I was really going hard and asking a few questions about the data dashboard this morning as well. Because if the data, such a lot of effort to collect the data or to present the data together, and if it's not done in a meaningful way that's going to matter to you guys and to community members, then I almost think it's a bit of a waste.
Have you seen any data or indication around substitution when cannabis does go out of a community around both prevalence and substance types? So how many of the people who are, say, using cannabis do go to a substitution of sniffing or alcohol or something else, and what the prevalence of both use and substance type?
Yeah, we did. I mean, I'm sure you guys see this in lots of communities. There are drugs that are in fashion and drugs that are not. And when I first moved to Muriel's community, petrol was kind of on its way out and avgas came in. So it basically turned the tap on petrol. Previously, most people, if you couldn't get cannabis, then you'd be straight away sniffing. But that wasn't the case when we were doing the research, because avgas came in. Just one community uses kava, and it's simply not fashionable in the other communities to use kava. It's very much tied to communities that have links to Yirrkala and the mainland in Arnhem Land. So that's why I think we saw so much violence and fights, because they were literally, when they couldn't get supply, everyone would smoke very, even heavily in terms of tobacco smoke, but they weren't going to something else because alcohol was really restricted because of the permit system. So they'd either fly off to Darwin and then maybe get caught in the long grass and have that story, or they'd be at home kind of starving for a bong and coming to the clinic because there's some kind of fight. So that's why I was talking about the context of understanding Gunja use in the context of everything else, because that picture is going to look so different for every community in terms of their access. Because in this community, it is off the mainland. They can't simply drive to Tennant or drive somewhere else. People were very, smart in how you get stuff in. But they would tend to switch to just, being in withdrawal.